So today we're going to answer the question, what is the best lance / best armor set for lance in the game? And is lance an elemental weapon in Sunbreak? Originally, I wanted to make a video about which lance to bring against each monster and to see how much better elemental sets can be. But halfway through the scripting process, I decided that explaining which monsters are susceptible to element isn't helpful without knowing what the meta sets are and how you ought to be building lance armor sets in general. So I've squeezed in a bit about the meta, but it's not as in-depth as I'd like it to be. I won't be explaining why certain lances I've picked are better than other lances. Normally it's because of sharpness reasons. However, I think that Title Update 1 is coming sooner rather than later, so we're going to have new weapons to play with, and we can talk more about weapon difference in that video. So let's crack on and get started with the meta. I've had a browse around, and there is a lot of misinformation. Normally, the place that I would recommend is the Monster Hunter Meta subreddit or the Discord chat in the Monster Hunter Gathering Hall Discord. I'll put links to them below. They publish quite good documents, and that's a good start, and it also encompasses a lot of different charm levels, so it's very accessible. However, this time around, there are a few mistakes / differences of opinion in the what switch skills should you use part of the document. They mentioned skyward thrust being not very good, and they also recommend that you use shield tackle over guard dash. That's wrong. Skyward thrust is situational, but when it works, it's the single best move Lance has. Similarly, shield tackle isn't something I'd recommend. It's explained best in my last video, but in short, losing access to guard dash is an effective 5% damage loss because you can't use the leaping thrust charged wide sweep combo. Shield tackle has some interesting utility, but I wouldn't recommend it over guard dash, and I definitely wouldn't call it meta. The armor sets listed are similarly close. They're good sets, but they take a generalized approach at the cost of damage. This is done in two ways. Firstly, the choice of lance. Gyasma is a good lance, and its damage is only bested when you look at the monsters more situationally. Secondly, the build recommends that you use the Deora ramp-up skill, and again, from a generalist approach, this is pretty good, but you are trading damage for convenience. The anti-species ramp-up decorations will always give you more damage, but to the credit of the metasheet, they do mention that. In the Gyasma Lance's best case scenario, you're only losing 1% of DPS by using the Deora ramp-up instead of the anti-species. That may already be enough to turn people away from using Deora, but in a worst case scenario, you'll be losing 5% of your damage from using Deora Soul rather than the anti-species, and that's on top of the other 5% loss from using Shield Tackle. However, I think a realistic expression of how much DPS is lost from using Deora instead of anti-species is about 3%. There are also a few issues that I have with the set as a whole. They assume that 80 hits of purple is enough to get you through the fight, or at least through the area, and I completely disagree with this. And considering quite a few of the sets listed don't have enough level 1 decoration space for speed sharpening, that makes getting caught out mid-fight quite nasty, as you'll be suffering another 5% damage loss until you can sharpen. And this makes the second issue I have more pronounced. I would suggest an alternative lance. If we plug Valstrax's lance into the same armor set, we can add an extra point of agitator from the lance's 2-slot decoration. We can then see that the effective raw of both lances is really close, and that's before we factor in element. But before we do that, we can also look at sharpness usage within the area. After its 80 hits of purple, Gyasmagorm's lance will drop to white for the rest of the area. And that's when its effective raw drops, and this is also where Valstrax starts to catch up. If we combine those values over the entire area, / before we sharpen, then Valstrax ends up 1% better than Gyasmagorm on raw damage alone. The counter-argument to this is that you can just sharpen mid-fight with Gyasmagorm's lance, but stopping to sharpen is also probably going to cost you 1% of your damage. And of course, that'll be much more if you've not got speed sharpening on your set. However, if you are somehow unconvinced by the sharpness argument, we can also factor in the elemental values on the weapons. Now, lance isn't an elemental weapon per se. You don't want to build armor sets around element values, but lance still benefits from element on the weapon. More on that later. And Gorm's rather small 15 dragon element is nothing compared to Valstrax's 42, and it makes a surprising difference. So, cutting to the chase, the break-even point for dragon element swaying the damage into Valstrax's favor is 5 dragon at a 55 raw hit zone or less. So, if the monster is immune to dragon damage, or has a 5 weakness to dragon damage, but a raw hit zone of 60 or higher, then Gyasmagorm's lance is only worse than Valstrax because of the sharpness. However, if the monster has more than 5 dragon weakness, then Valstrax outdamages Gyasmagorm before we even start factoring in sharpness. So, in the attempt to make this video as helpful as possible, there is one exception where Gorm's lance outperforms Valstrax. But it's in a situation that doesn't really exist, and so, again, this isn't really a, oh, Gorm's lance is actually the best kind of thing. This isn't a video about cats and dogs, so I'm going to be brief, but if you want a pet for damage, you want to bring gun dogs. Gun dogs are crazy strong, cats do not deal nearly as much damage as the dogs do. But cats still have a place, in the sense that they have utility. They can gather monster parts, they can heal you. And that puts the attack cat in the unique position of not really being worth it. However, their signature ability, Rousing Roar, when the cat decides to use the ability, will give you 30% affinity. And that 30% affinity would push Gyasmagorm's lance over Valstrax. But the real problem is by giving up a dog, you are doing less damage as a whole, even though your lance is doing more damage. However, all of this is a moot point, because there is actually a much stronger lance given the correct build and good use of it. And that lance is Ibushi. Technically, this is the strongest lance in the game. So strong that it beats out the elemental lances, more on that later, in all situations except one. So which mighty dragon could hold back the gale of the Ibushi Lance? That's right, it's Baggy. And that's only because Baggy is crazy weak to element. Ibushi still wins versus raw weapons. However, there are some serious caveats to this set. Firstly, it uses the new skill, Grinder S, and that means that you need a Grinder 2 2-slot charm to be able to use the armor set. And secondly, Grinder S can be difficult to keep its damage upkeep. Protective Polish 2 combines really well with Grinder 3, as it'll give you a 30-second window to burn through Ibushi's purple sharpness before the Grinder damage buff disappears. So there's a fair bit of sharpening mid-fight, and that's a high skill, high return sort of deal. In the absolute best case scenario, Ibushi is about 5% better than Valstrax. But because of uptimes and sharpening, I'd say it's more realistically like a 2% or 3% damage increase overall. Anyhow, for the rest of the video, we're going to assume that the Ibushi Lance doesn't exist because the charm is so specific that most people won't have access to it. Just as an extra thing, I want to briefly mention that there is a better Valstrax set than the one that I previously mentioned. It involves Bloodlust, and it's more or less a speedrun build, so I didn't use it as the Valstrax armor set within this test. But just in case someone finds Bloodlust useful, the Bloodlust Valstrax set is just shy of being 1% better than the Valstrax build that I've calculated all of this stuff with. So for most of you it doesn't matter, but if someone is interested in using the Bloodlust Valstrax set, then all of the percentages that I show you later on will be 1% more favourable to Valstrax. So, Elemental Lances. They all have a place, and they all run a similar Protective Polish build to minimise sharpening mid-area. I've seen other people suggesting different lances, but it seems like they haven't factored in how much sharpness the lance needs, so they lose out compared to the ones I'm recommending over the course of the hunt. The maths has been done at the highest level of charm value, but I'll also show off some template builds for people at lower charm levels, and there'll be some links in the description if they're not in the video themselves. So now that we've seen the builds, when do we want to use them? That's a very good question, and we can split all the monsters into 3 categories. One where element is worth using, one where you want raw, but the dragon damage makes Valstrax better than Gyasmagorm, and one where Gyasmagorm is better on a spreadsheet. The caveat to this list is that Valstrax is the only lance that won't require you to sharpen mid-area, and that makes the Valstrax lance arguably better in quite a few of the matchups. Looking at Valstrax's favourable matchups, you'll notice a lot of monsters like Tigrex, Chameleos, Espinas, which have good elemental hit zones for their weakest element, but it turns out that Valstrax has such good raw that those monsters' minor weakness to dragon element pushes Valstrax over using element weapons. You've also gotten monsters that are weak to dragon. Unsurprisingly, Valstrax is dominant in dragon weak monster category. The Gyasmagorm matchups are in 2 categories, as the spiders don't have a corresponding anti-species decoration, and that makes the Gorm Lance significantly better than its contenders. Gyasmagorm also lacks an anti-species decoration for it, but because it's so weak to dragon element, and the fight he's got a lot of health, and he's in an arena, it makes Valstrax better for Gyasmagorm. The rest of these Gyasmagorm favoured matchups are only better by about 1% or less, so they end up being equal or worse to Valstrax when you factor in sharpening. But I've left them in like this because if you're hitting the monster less than 80 times per area, then Gyasmagorn starts to be the better lance in that situation. But remember, if you sharpen mid-fight, Valstrax becomes better. With the fire-weak monsters, Auroracanth is only an elemental weapon if you're planning to use Skyward Thrust on its head frill. That's not the most optimal method of killing it, but a lot of people find Auroracanth quite annoying with Lance, so Skyward Cheese away if you want to. Otherwise, Valstrax is best. And then Almudron wins, but by such a small amount that Valstrax wins bigger when you factor in sharpness. Again, it's here in case anyone does less hits per second than what I've calculated. Water is a bit sad. There were quite a few water-weak monsters, but unfortunately it's only worth bringing water against Volvidon. Thunder is really strong against the crabs, Somnicanth and Titranodon. Grand Golem is only weak to Thunder when he's got stuff on his arms. And then Pookie and Steve have such a small increase over Valstrax that Valstrax wins when you factor in sharpness. Finally, Ice wins for Astalos when he's charged up, but not when he's in his normal state. So the choice of Ice versus Valstrax depends on how the fight is going. And Azuros is actually a great lesson in elemental hit zones. If you were to pick the single best element weakness that he has, then he's weak to fire, but he's weak to fire on his forelegs, and that's a bad physical hit zone. So if you look to where you want to be hitting, his rear, then you'll find that Ice is the best element for him. We've already covered Dragon, Valstrax, so that's more or less everything. The meta is really difficult in Sunbreak compared to older games like Iceborne because of how varied it gets thanks to Charm RNG. If anyone has kept up with Twitter, it seems like the next title update is going to double down on armor set RNG. So I think the next video, or at least the next Lance meta video, will be less about here are the best sets, and instead I'll focus on how you should prioritize armor skills, and that way we don't have to worry about charms, and instead you can build the best build that you have available. Other than that, some housekeeping. If you've got things that you want me to test, or if you've got video ideas that you'd like to see happen, then drop them in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. If you like the content, you can subscribe for more, and don't forget to like the video. But most importantly, thanks for watching.